The phone buzzed insistently in my pocket, cutting through my concentration like a knife. I wiped the sweat from my brow and stepped outside the makeshift clinic, where the midday sun cast long shadows over the village. The name on the screen made my stomach twist. Richard. I hesitated. Years of dealing with my stepfather's schemes had taught me that his calls rarely brought anything good, but curiosity or maybe a foolish sliver of hope got the better of me. I swiped to answer. Hello. Catherine. His voice was unnervingly cheerful. Too cheerful. Just thought you'd want to know if so the mountain cabin. I frowned. See. You did what? Sold it, he repeated, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. No need to be dramatic. It was just sitting there, unused, and, well, I had some debts to clear. A smug chuckle followed, the sound of it igniting something hot and furious inside me. Richard had been a thorn in my side since the day my mother married him. On the surface, he was charming, full of easy laughter and affable gestures, but beneath it all was a man who always put himself first or manipulated, took, and never thought twice about the damage left in his wake. And now, he'd taken the one place that meant everything to me. The cabin wasn't just a vacation home, it was a refuge, a place I'd poured years of love into, where I escaped after grueling work trips, where I gathered with friends for long weekends, where I felt most at peace. And now, Richard had tossed it away like a bargaining chip in one of his endless games. You had no right, I said, my voice trembling with fury. That cabin wasn't yours to sell. Relax, he drawled. You're never there anyway, Catherine. I did you a favor. Besides, it was an easy way to settle things. You'll thank me later. I'll thank you when hell freezes over, I snapped and hung up. My pulse thundered in my ears as I paced back and forth, trying to rein in the storm inside me. Richard had done plenty of awful things over the years, but this was beyond a betrayal. What he didn't know what I intended to keep to myself for now was that he couldn't have legally sold it. The cabin wasn't just mine. My best friend, Laura, was a co-owner, and the agreement we'd set up years ago required both our signatures for any sale to go through. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I sat on the edge of my cot, gripping my phone like it might break under the force of my anger. I had to call Laura, now. She picked up on the second ring. Hey, Kathy, what's up? Richard sold the cabin. The words tumbled out, raw with anger. Silence, Ton. Who what? He needed the money, I said bitterly, probably for gambling debts, but he doesn't have the authority to sell it without your consent. Laura let out a low whistle. He really thought he could get away with this. That man has no shame. Nan, I agreed. I need your help. Can you pull up our ownership documents? I want everything ready when I get back. You got it, she said, her voice still. We'll fight this together. As I ended the call, a strange calm settled over me. Richard thought I was too far away, too tied up in my work to stop him. He had no idea who he was dealing with. I wasn't the quiet, uncertain teenager he used to steamroll. I was an adult now only who knew how to fight back. The next few days blurred together as I finished my volunteer assignment, but the thought of Richard's betrayal lingered, like an ember that refused to burn out. Late one evening, I sat with my journal, letting the memories pour out. The first time I visited the cabin with my mom, the summers spent restoring it with Laura, the quiet nights by the fire when the work felt steady, even when everything else fell apart. This wasn't just a building. It was a piece of me. And Richard thought he could take that away. Oh, not this time. The next day, Laura called again, her voice brisk and all business. I went through the documents, she said. You were right. He had no legal right to sell. The sale is invalid. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by something sharper, anger. Do we know who he sold it to? Not yet. By checked county records there's no official transfer. Looks like he tried to do this under the table. Of course he had. Richard was always looking for a shortcut, always trying to cheat the system. What's our next move? I asked. We can't confront him, Laura said, or let the legal process handle it. Either way, he's got nothing. I exhaled slowly. Thanks, Laura. I don't know what I'd do without you. You'd figure it out, she said with a smile in her voice, but I've got your back. I hung up, my mind already sharpening into strategy. I'd finish my work here, head home, and deal with Richard myself. Not with shouting, not with anger. With something he never saw coming. A plan. And this time, I'd be the one holding all the cards. He thought he'd won, but by the time I was done, he realized he'd underestimated me for the last time. When I finally arrived home, the first thing that struck me was the silence. Normally, the cabin welcomed me with a sense of peace, a quiet retreat from the rest of the world, but now, that silence felt heavy, ominous. The houseplants by the window drooped from neglect, an open mail Saturday in a messy pile by the door, and the fridge was practically empty. I set my bags down and exhaled slowly, the weight of what I had to do pressing down on me. Before I could even unpack, my phone buzzed. Richard. For a split second, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but then I thought better of it. Time to face him. Well, if it isn't my globe-trotting stepdaughter, he said, his voice thick with fake cheer, finally back to reality. Ah. What do you want, Richard? I asked, cutting straight to the point. I just wanted to check in, he said, ounceing smartness. Make sure you're not too upset about the whole cabin situation. I mean, it's gone now, no use crying over spilled milk. My grip tightened around the phone. Funny you should say that, I replied coolly, because as far as I can tell, it's not gone. Laura and I checked the ownership records. The sale didn't go through. You can't sell what doesn't belong to you. Silence, just long enough to tell me I'd hit a nerve. That's ridiculous, Richard scoffed, his tone sharpening. The buyer paid in cash. The paperwork is handled. It's a done deal. No, it's not, I said evenly. Laura and I co-own the cabin. Remember, without her consent, the sale is invalid. Legally, it's still ours. A brittle laugh crackled through the speaker. You think you're so smart, don't you? Always playing the perfect daughter, always trying to control everything. You have no idea how hard I've had it. Catherine, I did what I had to do. You stole from me, I shot back. And you expect sympathy? You've made your choices, Richard. Now you get to live with them. The line went dead. He hung up on me. I stood there, staring at the phone, shaking with a mix of anger and satisfaction. For years, I had let Richard manipulate situations, guilt-trip me, take advantage of my patience, but not this time. This wasn't just about a cabin. This was about reclaiming my voice. The next morning, a Saturday at the kitchen table, laptop open, combing through the documents Laura had sent. The co-ownership agreement was ironclad. Richard's actions weren't just unethical, they were blatantly illegal. A sharp knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. When I opened it, there was Richard, standing on my porch, wearing his usual smug expression. Mind if I come in? He asked, stepping inside before I could say no. I folded my arms, watching as he made himself at home, like he hadn't just tried to steal from me. What do you want, Richard? Look, Catherine, he sighed, shifting into his signature condescending tone. I know you're upset, but try to see my side of things. I was desperate. The people I owed money to weren't exactly the forgiving type. I raised an eyebrow, and stealing my property was your best solution. Borrowing, he corrected, as if that changed anything. I was going to make it back once my luck turned around. I would have paid you back every penny. A bitter laugh escaped me. Your luck, that's your plan. Richard, you've been gambling away money for as long as I've known you. Has it ever worked out? His jaw tightened, but he quickly recovered. You're overreacting. It's just a cabin. You're barely even here. Because I'm working, I said coldly. Because I built a life. That doesn't mean the cabin isn't mine. And it sure as hell doesn't mean you get to decide what happens to it. His face darkened. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something like fear. You wouldn't actually go to the authorities, would you? He said, his voice quieter now. You wouldn't ruin your own stepfather like that. I leaned in. Try me. For once, Richard had no comeback. He stood up, muttered something under his breath, and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I exhaled, letting the silence settle around me. My hands were still trembling, adrenaline still humming in my veins, but beneath it all, there was something else's satisfaction. Richard was finally realizing that his usual tricks wouldn't work on me anymore. This wasn't just about the cabin. This was about standing up to someone who had spent years taking whatever he wanted. After his dramatic exit, I called Laura. "He showed up at my house," I said, pacing the living room. "Tried to play the victim, said he borrowed the cabin." Laura snorted. "Borrowed? Does he even hear himself? What did you say?" I told him the sale was invalid, and if he pushed me, I'd go to the authorities. "Good," she said, "but knowing Richard, he's already scheming his next move." "Let him," I said. "We've got the law on our side." Laura's voice turned businesslike. "I talked to a lawyer. We're drafting a formal cease and desist letter. If he tries to involve the buyer again, we'll have a legal paper trail ready to shut it down." Relief settled over me. "Thank you, Laura. I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'd figure it out," she said, then added warmly, "but we're in this together." Over the next few days, I focused on building my case. I documented everything: co-ownership agreement, text messages from Richard, even tracking down the real estate agent involved in the sale. When I finally got her on the phone, she sounded tense. "Look, I didn't know the full situation," she said quickly. "Richard told me he had permission to sell. If I'd known the cabin had a co-owner, I never would have touched the deal." "Well, now you know," I said, keeping my tone even. "I don't want to drag you into this, but I need your cooperation. Can you confirm that Richard signed the paperwork alone?" "Yes," she admitted. "The buyer hasn't paid in full yet, because I flagged the transaction as unusual. I can't provide you with the documents if you need them." "That would be helpful," I said, jotting down her information. As I hung up, a renewed sense of determination burned in my chest. Richard had banked on me being too distant, too passive to fight back. But he was about to learn just how wrong he was. That evening, Laura called with more good news. "The letter's ready," she said. "We send it first thing tomorrow. If he tries anything else, we escalate." A slow smile spread across my face. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was in control. Richard thought he could steamroll me. But this time, he was the one about to get crushed. But Richard was about to find out that I wasn't so easily defeated. The next morning, Laura and I finalized the cease and desist letter, each word crafted to be unyielding. We sent it straight to Richard, clearly stating that any further attempts to claim ownership of the cabin or engage the buyer would result in legal action. I imagined his reaction: outraged, confused, maybe even a little afraid. For years, Richard had relied on intimidation and manipulation to get his way, but now, he was up against something far stronger: the law. Later that afternoon, the real estate agent emailed me the documents she'd promised. When I saw Richard's signature on the fraudulent sale agreement, my stomach twisted. But it wasn't just disgust, it was also a steel-sharp clarity. He hadn't merely crossed a line, he bulldowned right through it. That evening, my phone rang. It was Detective Miller, the local officers Laura had reached out to for help. "Miss Daniels," he began, his tone professional but not devoid of sympathy. "I've reviewed the documents you and Miss Lally provided. It's clear that the sale was unauthorized. Based on the evidence, we can move forward with a formal investigation if you'd like." I didn't hesitate. "Yes, I want to pursue this. We'll begin by contacting the buyer and explaining the situation. If Richard continues to interface, we'll escalate to criminal charges for fraudulent misrepresentation," he continued, his voice steady. "Thank you, Detective," I said. "Let me know if you need anything else from me." When I hung up, I felt the weight of the situation shift. The wheels were in motion, and there was no turning back. The next day, Richard called. His voice was laced with anger, but underneath it, I could hear the desperation. "Do you have any idea what you've done, Catherine?" he demanded, his voice rising. "You're ruining everything." No, Richard, I replied, keeping my voice calm. I'm protecting what's mine. You did this to yourself. You've always been so ungrateful, he sneered, his voice thick with contempt. I stepped in when your mom couldn't handle things, and this is how you repay me. I couldn't hold back the bitter laugh that escaped me. You didn't step in, Richard. You took over. You manipulated, lied, and used people to get what you wanted. Now, you're paying the price. His voice rose again, but I cut him off. This conversation is over. If you have anything else to say, take it up with my lawyer. I hung up, leaning back in my chair, my heart pounding. Richard's days of pushing me around were over. 2 days later, Detective Miller called with an update. Miss Daniels, we've spoken with the buyer, and they've agreed to halt the transaction. They were unaware of the co-ownership agreement and are willing to cooperate with any further investigation. Relief surged through me. That's great news. Does this mean the sale is officially voided? Yes, he confirmed. The cabin remains under your and Miss Langley's ownership. However, we'll need to keep the case open to address your stepfather's fraudulent actions. Do you wish to press charges? I didn't hesitate. Yes, I said, my voice firm. I want him held accountable. Understood, Detective Miller replied. We'll proceed accordingly. Thank you for your cooperation. I ended the call and let out a long, steadying breath. The cabin was safe, and Richard's schemes were crumbling. For the first time in a long while, I felt a deep sense of peace settling in. Later that afternoon, I called Laura to share the news. The sale is officially void, I told her. The buyer's backing out, and the cabin is ours again. That's huge, Laura said, her excitement palpable. But what about Richard? The police are moving forward with the investigation, I said, my voice filled with determination. He's not getting away with this. Good, Laura said, her tone full of resolve. It's about time someone stood up to him. Her words lingered in my mind long after we hung up. For so long, I had allowed Richard to manipulate, guilt-trip, and intimidate me. But now, I fought back, and it felt like a turning point, not just for this situation, but for how I was going to approach everything from here on out. That evening, I went to the cabin for the first time since coming home. The familiar scent of wood and mountain air hit me as soon as I stepped inside. It was quieter than I remembered, but in a comforting way. I walked across the creaky floorboards, my heart beating with a strange mixture of nostalgia and triumph. I sank into the armchair by the fireplace, letting the warmth from the crackling fire wash over me. The stillness of the mountains surrounded me, and for the first time in weeks, I felt truly at peace. This cabin wasn't just a place, it was a part of me. This was my haven, a place where I could breathe, where I could escape from the chaos of the world. It was mine, no thanks to Richard. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to smile. I wasn't just reclaiming a property, I was reclaiming a part of myself. A week later, Detective Miller called with the final update. Miss Daniels, I wanted to let you know that your stepfather has been formally charged with fraudulent misrepresentation and attempted theft of property. He'll be required to appear in court, and based on the evidence we've gathered, the case against him is strong. Hearing those words hit me in unexpected ways. There was relief, of course, and a sense of vindication, but there was also a touch of sadness, a pang of recognition that the person I'd hoped could change never would. Thank you for everything, Detective, I said, my voice steady. You're welcome, Miss Daniels, he replied. We'll take it from here. I hung up the phone, feeling an overwhelming mix of emotions, but one thing was clear: Richard's days of controlling my life were over. And for the first time, I was free. I mean it, I said, my voice steady with sincerity. Detective Miller nodded. You handled this with a lot of strength. Standing up to family isn't easy, but you did the right thing. After the call ended, I sat in silence, absorbing the weight of it all. Richard had been a constant presence in my life for so be it a toxic on, and now, at last, I was free from his manipulations. The realization settled over me like a long-awaited exhale. The next day, Laura and I met at the cabin. She arrived with a bottle of wine in hand, a triumphant glint in her eyes. We settled on the porch, the cool mountain air thick with the scent of pine and earth. "To us," she said, raising her glass, "and to never letting anyone push us around again." I clinked my glass against hers, a soft laugh escaping me. "To us." As we talked, I found myself reflecting on everything this ordeal had taught me. For so long, I had avoided conflict, choosing peace over confrontation, especially when it came to Richard. But this time, I had stood my ground, and in doing so, I had reclaimed something. I hadn't realized I had lost my own voice. "You know," Laura mused, pulling me from my thoughts, "this cabin has always been more than just a place. It's a symbol of everything we've worked for, everything we've built." She looked at me, her gaze serious. "Don't ever let anyone take that from you again." Her words struck deep. The cabin wasn't just a structure nestled in the mountains. It was proof of my resilience, my independence. It was mine. That night, as I sat by the fireplace, wrapped in the comforting glow of the flames, I felt something I hadn't known in years: peace. Richard had tested me in ways I never expected, but in the end, I had come out stronger. The cabin was safe, my boundaries were firm, and for the first time in a long time, I felt fully in control of my life. In the weeks that followed, a new rhythm took shape. The cabin, once a battleground for Richard's greed, became my sanctuary again. Each creak of the floorboards, every rustling branch outside, reminded me of what I had fought to protect. I heard little from Richard after the charges were filed. My mother called once, her voice cautious. "You know how he gets, Catherine," she said, the familiar defense of him sounding hollow this time. "I do," I replied evenly. "That's why I did what I had to do." She didn't argue. For once, there was no attempt to guilt me, no desperate plea for reconciliation, just a quiet sigh before she said, "I hope you find peace." "I already have," I answered, and for the first time, I truly meant it. Laura and I spent the next few weekends restoring the cabin, painting the porch, patching the roof, planting wildflowers along the edge of the property. With each brushstroke and every nail bored, I wasn't just reclaiming a space, I was reclaiming myself. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Laura turned to me with a knowing smile. "So, what's next, Kathy? You've taken back the cabin, stood up to Richard. What's the next big move?" I considered her question, the answer coming easily. "I'm going to keep doing what I love," I said, "traveling, volunteering, living on my terms, but this time, I won't let anyone else decide how I live my life." Laura grinned and raised her glass. "To that." As the days passed, I reflected more on the lessons this battle had etched into me. It had never just been about Richard or the cabinet, was about recognizing my own strength. For years, I had let his behavior dictate how much I tolerated, how much I'd bend to keep the peace, but now, I knew I was capable of standing my ground, and I would never lose that part of myself again. That evening, as the last light of day dipped behind the mountains, I stood on the porch, breathing in the crisp, pine-scented air. For the first time in years, I felt truly at home, not just in the cabin, but in my own life.